Welcome to another of our virtual indie-focused screening events. I'm Mark Olsen. I write about movies for the Los Angeles Times, and it's my pleasure today to be leading a conversation about the movie Cyrano, an adaptation of the classic tale of Cyrano de Bergerac. In the film, a captain named Cyrano writes letters to Roxanne, the woman that he loves, on behalf of a young soldier named Christian. And the film stars Peter Dinklage, Halle Bennett, Kelvin Harrison Jr., and Ben Mendelsohn. And joining us to talk about it, we have the director of the film, Joe Wright, whose previous work includes The Darkest Hour, Anna Karenina, Hannah, Atonement, and Pride and Prejudice. Joe, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, thank you, Mark. Thanks for having me.
And I find the origins of this project so endearing in that Erica Schmidt had written a musical stage adaptation of Cyrano de Bergerac. It starred her husband, Peter Dinklage, your partner, Halle Bennett. And I can't help but wonder, like, at what point were you like, hey, I want to get in on this?
Well, Haley invited me to go and see a tiny workshop production that they were doing at the Chester Theatre in Connecticut. And I went along on the opening night and was struck very viscerally by the combination of Haley and Pete and how that relationship manifested. I'd loved the original story, the original play for many years, but seeing these two actors play these roles gave the play, gave the story a kind of authenticity and a immediacy that I found really affecting.
And what would you say is kind of the main thing that you would hope to sort of transport from the stage version to the movie?
A sense of intimacy. I mean, I think that with the stage version, I wanted to be closer. I wanted to be there, really close with Pete and Haley. And I wanted to. I didn't need them to sing to the back of the theatre. I wanted them to sing into my ear quietly, and so that was one of the impetuses for wanting to make an adaptation.
Because I'm trying to not use the phrase "open up," which is what people say a lot about like an adaptation of a stage, production to a movie. But yeah. What for you, like, what were some of the challenges in bringing the stage version to the screen?
Well, I think the opening sequence I understood could be much broader and say much more about the society in which these characters were living, the various stratas of society. So that was important. The theatre production, the workshop I saw was very much stripped back and pared down, and then also the war sequence needed a sense of brutal reality and harshness. So realizing that sequence without exposition, which is what the stage version relied on a lot, but telling that story visually was a challenge, certainly.
And now, just in the past year or so, there've been another of other movie musicals that have been coming out. And I'm curious to know, for you, like, what for you is kind of the enduring appeal of the movie musical?
The level of fantasy about it, I mean, our film is very specifically a fantasy of a period. It's really not set in any specific time or place, although the original was. That it's a dream and that it enters into this kind of dreamlike reality, and that you can take more creative liberties, really, with the kind of straight narrative. You're often feeling required to fill every inch of the screen with reality, which creates quite a passive experience for the audience. And I feel like the liberty one can take, the suspension of disbelief is more important than ever, and it's a more active, imaginative experience for the audience.
Because I've always wondered if, as a filmmaker, like as a musical, I've always wondered if sort of like, a Western, an action film, or a musical, like these are like the reasons you start filmmaking in the first place, is to eventually have a crack at like making your own musical.
Not so much. I mean, I've never really been into genre movies, I've never really I've always just been into drama. I've always been into the ability for cinema to tell me stories, bring me closer to people that I wouldn't come into contact with, to reveal the inner workings of the human mind and heart, that and connection, how we connect to other people. Drama for me is about human connection, or failure to connect, and this film is very much about that. I didn't really set out to go, I want to make a film, I want to make a Western, and I want to make a musical, or I want to make it's really about human stories.
And now this adaptation of the Cyrano de Bergerac story does away with what for many people is like the one thing they know about Cyrano, is that he's a guy with an overly prominent, very large nose. And was that like a point of discussion? Like what was the thinking behind sort of getting rid of the idea of Cyrano's nose?
The idea behind it was the sense in which we were thinking that maybe the nose got in the way of people identifying with the character. And if you took the nose away, you'd get into the core of what the story is about and its relevance for the individual audience member. This sense that it's about us feeling unworthy of love, or refusal to believe that others are capable of loving us, a fear of intimacy. Those ideas are at the very heart of the story. And we wanted to bring those to the fore rather than just making it about this nose.
And then you had Peter and you had Haley from the stage version. But can you talk a little bit about casting Ben Mendelsohn and Kelvin Harrison Jr. in particular? Like, did either one of them have experience singing?
Yeah, Kelvin had sung in a movie called The High Note.
Of course, yeah.
I'd seen him in Waves, and I just fell in love with him in that movie. And then I got to meet him and discovered him to be this kind of incredibly open-hearted, innocent guy who's kind of full of wonder at the world. And is so excited by everything he sees around him. And I thought those were qualities that could be really great for Christian. I didn't want a dumb Christian, and that's not the Christian that Kelvin delivers. He's certainly, tongue-tied when faced with the love of his life, but I think that applies to a lot of us. It's really this idea that he has this innocence and trust in others, which is diametrically opposed to Cyrano's lack of trust and indeed cynicism at times. Ben Mendelsohn and I had worked together on Darkest Hour and had a great time, and I called him up and said, Ben, can you sing? He was in lockdown at the time in LA, and he said, can I sing? Listen to this. And he sent me a video that he'd recorded of himself improvising this crazy big song, sounded a bit like kind of Tom Jones or something. And so I texted him back and went, great, you got it.
Because I
That was
have to
the
say,
casting process.
Ben in particular, he brings like a very unique energy to the role, and it's like it's a great addition to the rest of the cast.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He's yeah, Ben is certainly a very unique energy.
Yeah. And now this sequence that introduces Christian to the movie is this big sweeping number that takes place at this sort of garrison when he first enters, and just some of the logistics of that sequence are really a knockout. You have this ancient, this very antiquated location that you're using. You have what seem to be dozens, if not hundreds, of dancers. Like, what was that sequence in particular like?
That was an incredibly challenging sequence to do during the pandemic. We had specifically decided to build the theatre as an exterior set, kind of like an Elizabethan theatre, so that we had it was aired, and that would help with the COVID restrictions. And then we had a group of 120 extras who were part of who were our company of extras, really. And if you look carefully, you'll notice that they're in that scene, and then they appear as, a baker in another scene, or a soldier in the war scene. They appear throughout the movie because they were our kind of company who were COVID tested every day. And then there were like little ideas, like we're filming in Italy, and obviously Commedia dell'arte is very famous in Italy, and they wear these wonderful masks that have actually these kind of Cyrano noses. So I thought it'd be fun to make a reference to the original Cyrano nose in these masks that my mum made. My mum is a puppet maker and prop maker. And so she made 160 of these leather masks that would then also protect them and ourselves and everyone. So those appear throughout, and it was a joyous and hard section of the shoot. We were on night shoots for many weeks, and so that was challenging, and also because we couldn't bring in grip equipment from elsewhere. We had one package, that was it, that's all we had for the movie. And so we were really, cutting our cloth. But in a way, I always find that limitations are kind of liberating. That you go, okay, this is what I've got. How can I use these tools and only these tools to tell this story? So there's very little camera movement in the film, really. But we give the effect of camera movement by moving the cast and the extras rather than moving the camera.
And then can you talk some about the decision to have so much of the singing done live? Like, I'm curious, like, what kind of challenge does that present? I mean, typically you think of actors singing to playback, and in some ways I always wonder if like that's actually harder than live singing.
I think that might be harder. I've never tried it, but I think it might be. But it's certainly it was really the kind of obvious solution to me, because the question was about how to achieve a level of intimacy, a level of emotional performance that was truly authentic. And so to have the cast sing live on camera, they all had an earwig, so they were listening to the instrumental playback, and then were singing live. And I found that the cracks in their voices, or the breaths in the wrong place, or the faults really were where the humanity lay, and that was a really exciting lesson for me.
And then just the location that you're shooting in, this small town in Sicily, and then for the battle sequence on Mount Etna, those are just staggering locations. So like, you couldn't build those places if you want to. Like, for you, what did that town, that location in particular, bring to the production?
Well, I mean, as I was saying, this thing of limitations is really interesting. So we went, okay, we're going to shoot on Sicily. because there's very little through traffic, it being an island. And then we narrowed it down to this town, Noto, and everything apart from the war sequence had to be shot in that town. And so you then start to imagine, okay, if this society and these characters lived in this town, where would they live? And so the limitations start to offer you solutions, offer you a way into the story that is kind of exciting and also very specific. We were, very lucky to find Noto. It's a town that had actually been destroyed by an earthquake in 1692, I think. And rebuilt as this kind of Baroque masterpiece in a very short period of time. So it was a very complete set, and they gave us the keys to the city. There was this lovely old guy who everyone called the Professori, who had this giant bunch of keys and used to say, well, what about this building? Can we look in there? And he'd say, yes, see. And he'd open up the building, and he had a key to every building in the city, it seemed. I later found out that having thought he was kind of, a professori of history or something, he was actually the gym instructor from the local high school. But he was brilliant. So they gave us the keys to the city, and then about halfway, 1/3 of the way through the shoot, COVID was on the rise again, and we went into lockdown. Italy went into lockdown, but they allowed us to keep working. And so the town became incredibly quiet and ghostly. And it really was like a backlot, we were the only people out working. And that was an extraordinary experience. And then we went up Mount Etna, and that was a whole nother drama.
I like that there are actual keys to the city.
Yeah, they really are.
And then I want to be sure to ask, early in the film, there's a fight sequence, a really exciting sort of swashbuckling sword fight that Peter as Cyrano has, that you shoot in one take. And I mean, it's an astonishing sequence, and it's something you've done in Hannah, and of course you did in your film Atonement. Like, how do you sort of decide that like that sequence in the movie is one that you want to try to do as a one take sequence? And then once you make that decision, like what sort of challenges does that then lead you to?
Well, it has to be story led. There has to be a very, very good reason to do it. One doesn't want to, do it just to, I don't know, just to show off or something. It has to, and the point of that one was really making sure that the audience believed and understood Cyrano's prowess as a swordsman. And nailing that point, that character point, which was very important to Peter and I. And so that was the reason for doing that in one take.
The thing I always enjoy about a sequence like that is when you're like a little ways into it, and then you realize that like, oh, this is happening. And it's like, I always find it very exciting, that moment of recognition when you realize that that's how it's unfolding.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, you don't want audiences to really notice. You don't want audiences to marvel at the technical feat. You want audiences to be emotionally with the characters and forget about me and my camera,
And I think what might be my favorite sequence in the movie is the battle sequence, and that the song Wherever I Fall plays sort of throughout this long sweeping sequence. It drops out at times for dialogue and then comes back in. Like, for you, that sequence in particular, like, what was it like shooting that, and what did you like about having the song sort of come and go from the sequence in the way that it does?
That was certainly one of the hardest shoots of my career, and I've shot in some pretty extreme places. We were shooting originally at 16,000 feet near the summit of Mount Etna, a live volcano, as you know. And we were sure there would be no snow in December, so that was okay. So we built this set that was kind of trenches, and then we built a big camera platform that we could use as stable ground. And then 4 days before shooting, a giant snowfall came in and obliterated our set and made it completely inaccessible. So we moved down to about 8,000 feet, where the air was very, very thin, but we had no set at all, and certainly no crane or anything like that. It was all shot with a single camera and a tripod. And we had to improvise the whole sequence, which was terrifying. And then on the last day, the volcano erupted, and we had to pick up our camera cases and literally hot tail it off the volcano. But again, you know, when you're faced with obstacles, problems, the creative element is to find solutions. You know, what are the solutions? How can I tell this story with what I have in this environment? And that was, you know, it was exciting, and it meant that one had to be as economical as possible and as simple as possible. And that song just carried a beat throughout. As we shot that sequence, you just knew that this song was always playing in our heads, and and eventually on the screen, and it kind of guided us. The rhythm guided us through this very difficult period.
I also like so much that the song begins with 3 soldiers, each sort of writing a letter home, and the first soldier is the singer Glen Hansard, and you sort of recognize him, and you're like, wait, has he been in the movie the whole time? Like, I like this sort of like odd cameo that he has.
He's actually he does appear in the earlier sequences at the guards training hall.
Oh,
he's there in the background, because the thing is, you know, with the quarantine and everything, people had to come out, and then they couldn't go anywhere. You couldn't send people back and forth for you know, go home and see their families or anything. So it was tough on people. And the film was certainly an amazing act of defiance in the face of this kind of horrific circumstances. But yeah, so Glenn came out, did his costume fitting, got to know the other guards who were playing his friends, and they started actually busking on the streets of Noto at night for extra beer money. Not that we weren't paying them properly, we were, but they started busking, and they would play. And as I say, it was, you know, the film was conceived, well, I'd been developing the script for a couple of years before the pandemic, but it was in June 2020 when we'd been in lockdown for 4 or 5 months, and I realized that now we really had to just get out there and make a movie about the importance of compassion and the importance of human connection, of which we'd been so starved. And amazingly, you know, MGM went along with it, and we were able to get out there and create this bubble of extraordinary artists from all over Europe and the world, and made this film really a love letter to love, in defiance of the circumstances that the world faced.
One of the things I like so much about the movie is that it is so distinctly itself. Like, it has this sort of presentational style to it. There is something like epic and sort of romantic and sweeping about the movie. And when you're watching it, you sort of have to like sync up. Like, you have to sort of like get into the rhythm of the movie as you're watching it.
Absolutely.
And what is that like to create that? Is that a matter of sort of like editing and pacing, or like how do you sort of like create how does the movie teach the viewer how to watch it?
I wanted to make a film that was devoid of any cynicism or irony. I feel like there's too much cynicism and irony in the world right now. I wanted to make something that was just fully open-hearted and compassionate. And so each choice was made on that basis, you know, which kind of took me back to my parents' puppet theatre. I was brought up in a puppet theatre in London, and they created these shows, often sort of based on Oscar Wilde or Oliver Goldsmith or Hans Christian Andersen stories, with a sense of wonder and a sense of the love of life, and the beauty of the world and the beauty in human beings. And so really it was just keeping myself kind of tuned in to that sense, that sense within myself, which isn't, you know, always present in everything I do. You know, I can be cynical and angry or whatever, but that was the part of me that I was trying to express.
Because I've heard you say in another interview that every movie you make, you try to act like it's your first movie, mm-hmm. Like you sort of try to approach things in that way. And what do you mean like that? What do you feel like you sort of gain by having that sort of perspective as you're working on something?
I feel like it allows me to keep an open mind. You know, I don't want to prejudge anything or anyone. I want to stay responsive to those that I'm working with and to the story that I'm trying to tell. I've never told this story before. And so what is the appropriate cinematic expression of this very specific story? And that's different with every movie. So I guess that's what I mean. And you know, yeah, sure, there are things I've learned along the way that I can kind of go, oh, I know that's not going to work. I won't try that. Or techniques that I've tried that I like. But I was trying, for instance, with this. I mean, it's funny that you should call the film presentational, because in a way I was trying to avoid presentational. Maybe I've got stuck in it or something. But you know, my last 2 or 3 films have been quite presentational in their use of wide-angle lenses and kind of very specific blocking and so on. And I wanted, because of the musical form, I wanted to make. Sorry, my dog's growling. I wanted to make a movie that was less presentational, more observational, to counter the theatrical musical form. And also because I didn't have much, you know, track or crane available. I was, you know, working with limited resources. So a lot of the film's longer lenses and finding characters and moving the characters rather than the camera, as I said earlier. So I was going for something kind of more observational. I can't remember what the question was, but that's yeah, that's I don't know.
And I'm afraid that we're out of time. So with that, we're gonna wrap things up. Joe Wright, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about Cyrano.
Thank you, Mark. Pleasure.